Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the John Doyle Show Thanksgiving special. It is a four-pronged Thanksgiving special. We will talk about on the internet Thanksgiving as a uniquely American Christian holiday, how the Pilgrims believed that they were giving thanks to God for the blessings, including this new land, which they believed was theirs to conquer and to spread Christianity, the subversion of this into being about freaking harmony with Indians and then whites freaking betraying them for no reason at all, the reality of Indian savagery, incompatibility with civilization, debunking this myth of the pre-civilization Rousseau state that libtards like to masturbate to, and why we, likewise, give thanks to God for our wonderful American civilization, and we apologize for nothing we did to establishment and nothing we will do to restore it. And then we'll also mention a little bit of, speaking of Indians, our friend Vivek Ramaswamy, who I guess posted this clip that was really bad about how we should fix American education. We will epically dunk on that, and then we will also have our friend Auron MacIntyre on to discuss the reality of American history in so many different ways. Do stay tuned. Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the John Doyle Show. We're going to start off before we talk about our history with Indians. We're going to talk about our current existence with Indians because we had a video from our old friend, Vivek Ramaswamy, that was posted. And at first it was so insane that people thought it was actually AI generated. But since, I guess, people in his circle have doubled and tripled down on it. The idea behind the video is, of course, in context to his gubernatorial run in Ohio. It's a solution to solve education or whatever. I'm just going to play the video for you, and then we will discuss. We will break it down on the internet for you. So take a look.
Make parenting more affordable by making school year round and going till 4 o'clock instead of 3 o'clock so you don't have to pay for childcare.
All right, man. Look, this was something that I realized very early on because I used to get out of school on June 11th. I have memories in my brain of getting out maybe June 6th, and then it became June 8th and June 11th. I remember in 5th grade, at least, it was June 11th. And then slowly over time, by the time I got into high school, I'm getting out June 23rd. We just keep adding days on. And the reason for that is because all of these very smart, sophisticated people get together and they look at the way that American students are not performing as well as they used to. They're looking at the way that test scores are going down, grades are going down. And so naturally they conclude, well, our system, which has existed in its current state at the same time as this decline in performance and test scores, is clearly not working. Or actually, it's working perfectly. So the solution must be that we just need to throw more of that at American students because for some reason they're just falling behind. They don't appreciate it as much as maybe students from prior generations. So there's been this lifelong effort to put American kids in school for more days out of the year, for longer hours, XYZ. And the problem with this is, first of all, it makes a lot of people a lot of money because you get to write policy papers and do freaking studies and consult. And it makes people feel very good to sort of approach the elephant in the room and say, actually, it's this peaceful problem. And guess what? You don't have to deal with your kids anymore because you hate kids. So you get to send them to school for more days out of the year, more hours out of the day. The problem is that the demographics of the country have changed. You are bringing in people from countries which have historically not been so academically inclined, we'll say, as Americans. And we know that this is true because when you look at the PISA, the PISA scores of how students in different countries perform, you isolate for specifically white American students, we're top 5 in the world. But if you look at America as a whole, now all of a sudden our scores are going down. Now all of a sudden there's cause for alarm. Now all of a sudden we need to keep American kids in school more because for some reason they're just slipping behind. Are we sure? It's the same thing, when I was a naive young man and I would look at statistics about gun violence in Europe versus gun violence in America. When you control for the white American gun violence rate per capita, assault with a weapon, murder, whatever, you control for just that. Curiously, it mirrors essentially what you would see from these countries in Europe. So it's very unfair to compare America to European countries, to other countries, when our demographic situation is so unique. And so I really hate stuff like this because what it is saying is that we're going to have to waste more time that we don't have entertaining solutions that aren't even going to work and that are going to basically make the lives of young American students more miserable because they're doing fine in school, actually. They're getting good test scores. They would be getting into good colleges. But it's all this DEI nonsense that is destroying what should be just the freedom of the American boy to just kind of mess around and have fun, but still just coast his way into success. That is our birthright, and that is what people like this seem to enjoy. Disrupting is evidenced, of course, by his meltdown last Christmas. Remember that? He effort posted. He wrote an entire thing. Christmas 2024. We're out there. We've got gingerbread. We've got midnight church service. And this guy is on Twitter talking about how Americans are lazy. We need mass migration. We need H-1B visas because Americans are lazy. They spend too much time watching Saved by the Bell. They spend too much time having sleepovers instead of studying and entering into math Olympics or whatever, all this stuff. And it's just simply not true. You want to know a great example of this? I think it was Neil Armstrong or maybe Buzz Aldrin, one of these characters. He got into MIT. Obviously one of the greatest countries or one of the greatest schools in the country. So he gets into MIT and he refuses to attend there because he wanted to go to Purdue, which obviously great school, however, less academically prestigious than MIT. But he chooses to go to Purdue because he liked the football team more, because he was this kind of boy. He was an American boy. He understands that he'll probably be okay. He's got a good head on his shoulders. He doesn't need to be this like striver, chasing credentials, XYZ, spending more time in freaking school. He knows that's not the problem. He'll be fine. So he goes to Purdue and he ends up going on the moon, which he did. We'll talk about that at a later time. So Vivek is obviously, poised to be the governor of Ohio, or so he thinks. He's been endorsed by President Trump, which is something I disagree with. Everyone says you can never disagree with President Trump. Everyone says John Doyle never disagrees with President Trump. I disagree with this. His opponent, who's a Democrat, inherently evil, by the way, for every conceivable reason, she's actually been outflanking Vivek on the issue of H-1Bs and immigration from the right. I don't think she's sincere. I think she's just being smart. She knows that Ohio is now red, but it's gone blue before, blue collar, working class whites. If you've got this guy who shows up and is talking about, these things, like, yeah, you can outflank him in a way that's going to be advantageous to you. But she's dominating him even as like a no-name loser Democrat in a state that's been consistently red for a while now. And she's supposedly appealing to these kind of like American workers, whatever. Whereas Ramaswamy, his like past and present rhetoric does support this like total replacement of American workers with people from the global south, with people from the third world who are supposedly more skilled than us. And if you look at this video, it is a disaster. He's pushing for more schooling so that, and then also too, the idea that like American women can just like stay working for corporations as cogs in the corporate wheel rather than watching over their own kids, raising their own children. It's everything but like addressing the actual issue, everything but solving the real problem, just making it easier for the problem to continue and to persist, for children to be raised by like, strangers, for children to be replaced in their own communities. Just a disaster. People literally thought it was AI. They're like, no way he would ever do this. Yes, he would, dude. These people are shameless. They really believe like everything they're saying, and they believe that you are so out of touch that it has to be enforced upon you, which is why they never apologize for saying you're an American, you're inadequate. Our culture, our people have to be enforced upon you. They view all of this as like revenge against the Anglo. So there's just no place in it. There's no place in American politics for this kind of stuff. This kind of America last, mass migration, anti-Christian, doesn't even eat meat. I think President Trump is mistaken here. I understand why he's doing it, but I think he's mistaken. That's been the case before. This is the past version of the party. This is a guy who was literally quoting W. Bush's 2000 inauguration speech when he gives his, prescription for how to solve the crisis of American identity, that we can all be united by our ideals, which means it doesn't matter if we import 1 million people from this country, 1 million people from this country. It's fine if we all agree to just believe in the same thing, right? Okay, well, how is that enforced? How is that even possible? Do we know that that's possible? Yes, we know it's impossible, actually. And look, I've always been like a practical guy. I would never vote for a Democrat. You can pry my straight ticket Republican ballot from my cold, dead hands. However, this guy is so bad that, like, at this point, look, Ohio will probably be okay, right? I don't know. I think that we do, if we do believe the words we're saying that immigration is the most important issue, and you've got a guy who is not even, like, pro the Trump agenda on dealing with immigration, pro, obviously, like, limiting legal immigration, completely shutting the border for illegal immigration, a guy who's not even, like, tacitly or secretly pro-mass migration, he doubles and triples down on it, and he insults you for being opposed to it. That guy probably should not be allowed to ascend in Republican politics. We should probably abstain. It'd be one thing if it's a presidential race. I think Ohio will be fine. I have confidence in the Ohioan spirit, even as a Michigander myself. No more brother wars for the time being. We can get back to that momentarily. I would support some kind of like Republican primary challenger against Vivek. I would support a pro-Trump patriot, a guy willing to, maybe take hits from Trump for opposing his endorsed candidate, but that nevertheless is America first and is willing to work with Trump because, again, we can understand maneuvering. We can understand that it's politics. You have to make concessions. But if the one issue that is fueling our entire drive right now, and that without it, we are going to literally lose forever, we can accept no compromise on that issue. So yeah, this is a total disaster. Anyway, if you want to cope with that disaster, let me tell you about our friends over at Flying Ace Straight Bourbon. It doesn't just check the boxes. I've told you this, it rewrites them. You've got a blend of carefully aged bourbons. It's delivering a smooth sip. It's got real depth. Think caramel, vanilla, playing the hits, toasted spice, a hint of fruit. It's bold, though not harsh. Complex, but it's not LARPing, right? It's a bourbon that actually lives up to its label. So go grab yours right now at flyingacespirits.com. Use code BLAZE for free shipping. It is so important that you do this. Yes, we cannot overstate the importance of Thanksgiving, a holiday, America's first holiday meant to give thanks to and to conquer for Christ. And you've got these distortions, the myth of the smallpox blanket. It's literally just not even true. You can Google it. It's so not true that Google will be honest about it. It's not even true. How we freaking genocided the wholesome Indians who had never encountered warfare before Europeans introduced it to them. That's not true. But even then, just be thankful you get to be a war trophy, right? You get to be a part of the story. There are entire civilizations of people that have just been completely forgotten about. You get to be a football team. You get to be a helicopter. I think that's pretty cool. Maybe I'm half full, but I respect that. I respect that you were ferocious. And I think a lot of your aesthetics were cool. You get to be a part of America's history. That's fine. Sorry about that other stuff, but, the ornaments are cool, right? So we will discuss Thanksgiving as the first American holiday for God. We'll discuss, the whole, attempts to vindicate Rousseau with the decolonization is like a vindication of the, state of nature, and how in pre-civilization we didn't even have warfare, but then white people invented it because they're freaking evil, and then they betrayed the freaking peaceful Indians for no reason, again, because we're evil and white. So we know that. We know the cartoon version of Thanksgiving that they make you act out in 4th grade. And I'm not even opposed to that. I like it. The shoes with the buckles, the paper mache hats. But then you get your smiling pilgrims and your smiling Indians, and we're singing Kumbaya around a big freaking happy table, and we're doing trust falls and making friendship bracelets and all that. We're eating turkey and mashed potatoes, singing about how sharing is caring. And then this booming voice echoes throughout the sky to tell us that this beautiful moment is ruined when evil whitey betrays their cool new friends for no reason, except for their being evil and white, and so it's in their nature. That story is just a lie, and worse than that, it is a deliberate lie intended to make you feel guilty about the greatest civilization in human history. Thanksgiving is not actually just this multicultural drum circle. This is a uniquely American Christian holiday. It's a story of English Puritans kneeling in the snow, thanking God for bringing them to a new promised land, a land he had emptied of its previous inhabitants so that his people could inherit it, civilize it, and then build the wealthiest, most free, most powerful nation in the history of the world. And so today, we will tell that story in honor of these just truly unbelievable men and women, and of course in honor of God and in thanks for the blessings that he's given to us. So let's start with the chosen people, the people at the heart of Thanksgiving. The first thing is that the Pilgrims were not just your generic settlers, right? They weren't even just English, nor were they these, treasure hunters looking to get rich, roll the dice in the new world. No, these were radical English separatists. These were people who were just radical Puritans. They rejected the Church of England. They thought it was too corrupt. And prior to even going to the new world, they flee England and they settle in the Netherlands, in Leiden. But while they're there, their life is already difficult. I mean, they're treated as foreigners. They're forced to labor long hours in weaving and shoemaking and stuff like that. But beyond that, their greatest fear was still spiritual. Their children were slowly becoming Dutch in both custom and language. And at this time, the congregation believed that God was calling them to establish this truly English holy community somewhere else. And there are other things going on at the time, too. You've got the 30 Years' War, you've got this comet seen in the sky around 1618, and these events are all wrapped together and given this, millenarian apocalyptic interpretation that the end is near, and the Pilgrims believe this, and specifically that their role to play in this was to bring Christianity to the New World, purified of all of the corruptions that it may have accrued while in England and generally in like continental Europe, but they also knew that this was going to be incredibly difficult. They knew that the previous English attempts to settle America had sometimes ended, we'll say, catastrophically. Jamestown had lost the majority of its settlers to starvation and disease, but ultimately, this does not dissuade them. And a huge part of this determination to see this through on their part was driven by their belief in this religious mission. And usually people, when, discussing the difficulties about like the voyage and everything, they often talk about the hardships of living in the New World. Obviously that's true. But for the Pilgrims, their hardships didn't even begin then. Like they actually began, like we said, in Europe. Like no part of this was smooth for them. There was internal conflict. There were financial shortfalls. There was even ship trouble. There was a smaller ship that was meant to accompany the Mayflower called the Speedwell. And as soon as it set sail, it began springing leaks and having all types of problems, and it was ultimately unfit for the voyage. But even beyond that, the Pilgrims eventually realized the ship was actually being sabotaged by its own commander to make sure that it wasn't even fit for the Atlantic crossing. So, this got so bad that the leaders of the Pilgrims at that time, or one of them, Robert Cushman, he assumed that all of these delays were just like divine punishment, and he began suffering physically himself. He thought he was going to die soon. But again, this did not dissuade the Pilgrims as a whole. They kept going. Except Cushman, he didn't even end up making the voyage, but many of the rest did, including William Bradford, patriot, by the way, would later become the governor of Plymouth in the New World, and actually during the first Thanksgiving as well. And he sold his home, the home he lived in at the time, prior to this voyage. Even during all of these difficulties, when it seemed like, it's so over, the end is upon us, being beset on all sides with problems, he sells his house as a commitment to this voyage. He had skin in the game. So the Speedwell doesn't even end up making the journey. Some families decide to remain behind. They couldn't hang. And the voyage itself, like we probably all know, is brutal. I mean, there's gale force winds slamming the ship. Passengers are confined in lightless, airless quarters. They're seasick for weeks. They thought they were going to die before even reaching land. They were even mocked by one of the crewmen pretty viciously. Bradford actually writes about this, but ironically, he was actually the first person to die on the Mayflower. He got sick and he died. So he's mocking these Pilgrims and taunting them about, how he's going to be throwing their bodies overboard pretty soon. But actually, he's the first person to die. And of course, the Pilgrims, they just take this as a sign of God's justice. And when they arrive, they don't arrive in Virginia. They arrive at Cape Cod. They had a patent that required them to settle in Virginia. So they're way off mark. And they had trouble sailing south, so they decide not to. They decide to stay right where they were in Cape Cod. And again, they saw all of this as providence. And before going ashore, they draft something called the Mayflower Compact, which is signed by a lot of the men on the ship. Only men sign it. And this was considered to be like this binding covenant, binding them together for the glory of God and for the advancement of the Christian faith. And it's not really mentioned anymore as truly like a founding document of America. You can guess why. But it used to be much more well-known, even into like the 20th century. And so once they get ashore, they realize that this isn't like a fertile land overall. It's actually kind of bleak and just this like frozen wilderness. Bradford calls it a hideous and desolate wilderness. And they're there. They have no shelter, no friends, no allies. Jamestown, being the closest English settlement, is like 500 miles away, and winter is coming. And this is during a period, by the way, that's known as the Little Ice Age. So the winters are even harsher than they usually are compared to like winters today in New England. And by the end of this winter, even though they began with like 100 or so people, they end with like 50. They basically lose half their women, half their children. They suffer from scurvy on the Mayflower. And then winter brings pneumonia, the freezing cold. So there are not even many people who are able to care for the ones who are sick. And on top of this, they're having to bury their dead like clandestinely in secret because they don't want the nearby Indian tribes to know. And there's at least 3 of them that are pretty notable. They don't want these Indian tribes to know how weak they are at the time. So literally like no bitches, no clout, and their race is dying, yet they continue. They do not blackpill. And the men and women on the Mayflower actually called themselves saints. They called themselves God's elect, the covenant people of the living God. These pilgrims were not just, gentle Quakers in search of religious tolerance. No, these were like hardcore Calvinist Puritans who saw themselves as living through the last days of history and believed that God had chosen, like he chose ancient Israel, them to build a new civilization in the wilderness. William Bradford, patriot, again served as the governor of the Plymouth colony for several terms. He wrote that the Pilgrims were, quote, hunted and persecuted on every side in England, and that their journey to America was for the glory of God, for the advancement of the Christian faith. John Winthrop, He arrived 10 years after the Mayflower's voyage. He made it even more explicit in his famous sermon aboard the Arbella, a model of Christian charity. He proclaimed that the Pilgrims' colony would be as a city upon a hill, and that by migrating to the New World, they had entered into a new covenant with God, and if they kept his laws, he would bless them, but if they failed, he would curse them worse than he cursed the Egyptians. This was the reality of 1620 Plymouth. They believed the Bible was a binding contract and that North America was their reward for keeping true to God, for enduring these hardships. And Bradford continuously used language from the Old Testament to describe the Mayflower's journey and the settlements in general. The Mayflower Compact was not this like democratic, multicultural experience. No, this was a church covenant that included every adult male on the ship for the most part, so the colony could function as a single, disciplined congregation under God. And when half the colonists died during their first winter, Bradford did not chalk it up to just bad luck or misfortune. No, he said God was testing and purifying his chosen remnant, just how he tested and purified the Israelites in the desert. And this theology is why the first Thanksgiving, the real Thanksgiving, was first and foremost a religious event. When the harvest came in, Governor Bradford, patriot, ordered a celebration, a whole day of celebration, a feast to thank God for his blessings on the colony. The Wampanoag Indians didn't just like get a party invite, like the gunfire that attracted them in the first place, which is why they were even at the event. They heard gunfire, they went towards it. That was part of Puritan worship. That was volleys of praise to the God who had taken his people through these trials of death and starvation to a land with potential to be overflowing with milk and honey. And everything that came after this, from, the expansion of the American colonies to the eventual conquest of the continent, all of that came from this conviction. America was not discovered, it was inherited by divine right. It is our duty to impose ourselves upon this world for God, and because we are capable of civilization, and the world is better off for it. So imagine that. Imagine landing on Plymouth Rock in 1620. You're finding mile after mile of already cleared farmland, cornfields ready to be planted, empty villages with no residents, freshwater brooks running to the shore. That is exactly what the passengers of the Mayflower found. William Bradford, he wrote that Plymouth looked as though it had been prepared by God himself for their arrival. He described entire ghost towns where, like skulls and bones lying in ruined houses, no natives left to stop the Pilgrims. Because what the Pilgrims witnessed was the aftermath of one of the greatest demographic catastrophes that has ever occurred in history. Between 1492 and 1600, you had these like old world diseases just sweeping the Western Hemisphere, similarly to like the angel of death over Egypt. I mean, you had smallpox, measles, influenza, all these other ailments, and they killed somewhere between like 90 to 95% of the indigenous population of the Americas. And in coastal New England, the collapse was almost just total. I mean, the plague that hit the tribes of Massachusetts between like 1614 and 1620 literally wiped out entire tribes within months. And research suggests actually that like the pre-contact population of what is now the US and Canada was around 5 to 7 million. Okay, so after the epidemics, as few as like 300,000 of them remained. And modern scholars actually confirmed the immense scale of the die-off. Charles Mann called it the greatest population collapse in history. So when the Pilgrims landed, they were just walking into this like post-apocalyptic wasteland whose civilization had already totally fallen apart, where forests were already reclaiming these abandoned fields. And the most famous Indian in the Thanksgiving story, Squanto, he was himself a victim of this collapse. His entire tribe, the Patuxet, had been annihilated by the 1614 plague, and Squanto himself only survived because he had been kidnapped years before and sold into slavery over in Spain. Now he comes back, he's free, he comes home. It's 1619, he finds nothing left, nothing but skeletons. And Bradford even described Squanto as a special instrument sent of God for their good beyond their expectation. And Squanto didn't fight these people. No, he taught them how to plant corn in the fields that his people had cleared, because he believed pretty much that, like, okay, well, someone else might as well use it. Everyone else is dead, and it's not because of freaking smallpox blank. It's literally not even a real thing. They invented that. They made it up in their minds because they're evil. And Bradford, by the way, he did not like mince words about the theological meaning of all of these events. He stated that it was the special providence of God that the natives were swept away and that the way was cleared for his people to take possession of this new land. The idea of God clearing territory for his chosen people was not an idea that the Puritans just made up to justify themselves doing what they want. No, they read it every week in their Bible. Now, none of this means, of course, that every acre that the colonists took was taken justly. Wars happen, treaties were broken, men sinned. But the original Plymouth colony that settled on territory, it was settling on territory that had no living owners left. The Pilgrims did not just march in and start killing peaceful villagers. No, they entered a vacuum created by disease and built a new civilization and then defended it. This is the providence that they celebrated in 1621, and it's something that we must acknowledge on our holiday. But instead, what's the message? What do we hear? Every November, we see the same images. We get peaceful Indians in pristine forests, perfect harmony with nature, just like Rousseau said. They're gathering berries. Bambi lines up to be served, mashed potatoes and a roast and everything else. This image is not real. This image was invented in the brothels of 18th century France. Rousseau never once set foot in America. But he needed this fantasy of like the noble savage in order to attack Christian Europe because he was evil and retarded. And 2 centuries later, progressive academics still treat this fantasy as though it's gospel, when the reality was literally the opposite. Like freaking what? Europeans invented civilization, but they couldn't even figure out how to share until the Indians taught them? I guess we know who the real civilized people are. Like, give me a break, dude. Before the epidemics, the Americas were a pretty crowded place. You look at like archaeological surveys, the evidence, it puts the population of the Western Hemisphere somewhere in the range of like 50 to 100 million people in 1491, roughly the same as the population of Europe at the time. Okay, these indigenous people built giant cities such as Cahokia, which is located near modern-day St. Louis. It was actually larger than London in 1250. They had earthen pyramids, extensive road networks, giant agricultural works. Then, in the century after Columbus's voyage, 90% or more of these people just like died, leaving essentially a continental graveyard, a continent-wide graveyard for the Pilgrims to more or less walk into. And the Indians did not leave behind a legacy of ecological harmony, but rather they left like the wreckage of a dead civilization. The coastal tribes which the Puritans met were simply like the scattered remains living in the ruins of what had been massive cities only a generation prior. Abandoned fields were being reclaimed by the trees, while entire villages were just left empty after their residents died. Like our famous virgin wilderness that would go on to enchant many writers. That was brand new. That was the product of a rapid decline in population. But even before this, like whole, pre-colonization of America, the land was far from Eden. Apologies to the Mormons. Because if you look at the same researchers who document the population collapse itself, they also document the incredible environmental destruction that was left behind. Indians basically use fire like a bulldozer, so if something was in the way, they would simply like light it on fire and delete it. And so they were burning forests every year to clear land for hunting and for farming. And studies actually show that the Indians burned so many trees that when they stopped, it literally caused a measurable drop in global temperature. In other words, the little ice age that froze Europe from the late Middle Ages to like the 1800s, that was partially caused by Indians because they were burning so much wood that they accidentally warmed the planet. And when the burning stopped because the burners were dead, the climate flipped the other way. Nature began to heal. What is it with Indians and polluting? It's a tale as old as time. And this is not even to get into, by the way, the savagery of the supposed noble savage. There was nothing noble about them. You can be ferocious, you can even be a good fighter, but nobility is a completely different word. It does not map onto what we're describing, and we're going to do an entire deep dive into this myth of like the harmonious pre-civilization, all that. But for now, our noble savages were also just like a terrible steward of animal life. Forget just human life. Indian hunters were known for wiping out entire flocks of birds. Buffalo hunters in the Great Plains would drive whole herds off cliffs and just like leave most of the meat to rot, basically. Slavery, of course, was a universal practice among entire Indian nations. Cannibalism was practiced from Mexico to the Mississippi River. And Indians, by the way, not white people, Indians invented scalping. I mean, you had human sacrifice, demon worship. Yeah, sorry, all of that will stop now. A bit mad, isn't it? That's proper Pharaoh, mate. We don't do that here. So by the time the Pilgrims arrived, the tribes of the Plymouth colony were basically living in what anthropologists would term an end-stage society. Constant warfare, refugee movements, psychological scarring from the plagues, like all of this had destroyed whatever political order existed prior to 1492, to the extent that it even did. The Wampanoag under Massasoit feared the Narragansett to their west, who had been less impacted by the plagues and now outnumbered them like 10 to 1. And this is why Massasoit made an alliance with the Puritans within months of their arrival. He needed allies to survive. He didn't think the Pilgrims were like his spiritual brothers. It wasn't about freaking sharing. And this is what the libtards don't want you to know, by the way. The land the Mayflower's passengers settled was not stolen from this like thriving civilization that lived in total peace with nature. They literally just made that up in their head. They inherited it from the dying remnants of a civilization that had already collapsed, and the Pilgrims went on to build the greatest civilization in the history of the world atop the ruins. You are welcome, not conquered, finessed, but also kind of conquered, but that's okay, and that's epic, and that's why we celebrate. That's why they celebrated. That was the whole point. The reason for the first Thanksgiving, far different from the myth that everybody is sold as a child. In the fall of 1621, after the corn harvest, Governor Bradford, world historic patriot, declared a day of thanksgiving to God. And the colonists spent the day praying and singing psalms before holding military drills, firing their muskets into the air, their cannons in celebration. And the gunfire was so loud that it was heard for miles. And that noise caught the attention of the Wampanoag chief Massasoit, who brought 90 of his warriors to the village uninvited. And they didn't bring pumpkin pie. They didn't sing a song about the wonders of diversity. No, they were armed, and they believed that the Pilgrims were under attack by a common enemy, other Indians, who they were ready to slaughter. Which, like, hey, that's fine, but, not very Rousseauian, but we'll take it. So, of course, Governor Bradford greeted them. He offered them food, and the Indians decided to stay for 3 days. They hunted deer. They brought them to the feast. The Puritans contributed ducks, geese, cornbread. There was feasting. There was wrestling. There was more shooting guns into the air, American as apple pie, and then everybody went home. And that was that. Edward Winslow, who also he served as a governor of the Plymouth colony after William Bradford, likewise a Mayflower passenger, a Mayflower Compact signatory, he wrote that the purpose of the celebration was to rejoice together after we'd gathered the fruit of our labors and to give thanks to God. Not once did he mention or even reference any lectures on gratitude, signing some kind of treaty of eternal friendship, and Bradford's journal doesn't even mention the Indians. To him, the celebration was about thanking God for their survival, thanking God for their prosperity, nothing more. Some Indians show up, cool, we'll be hospitable, but it's not about them. It's not about us and them, our relationship. It's about God. It's about God's blessing, giving us this wonderful food, this wonderful land, this wonderful life. We didn't die. Using this life to spread his message, to expand Christendom until we hit another ocean. So this was not the birth of multiculturalism. This was not a betrayal. This was a somewhat impromptu Puritan holy day that accidentally turned into a 3-day party when the local tribe showed up to see why the white people were making such a racket with their guns, as we do. God forbid white boys get a little goofy. God forbid that we remember that the first rule of gun safety is to have fun. But anyway, within 50 years, those same Wampanoag would be nearly wiped out in King Philip's War. Oh well, it happens. But that was the first real Thanksgiving. It was no hand-holding, no land acknowledgments. No, it was just English Christians praising the God who saw them through a pretty torturous year, and a wary Indian war band making sure the new kids on the block were doing all right. Okay. And 200 years went by. Nobody called the 1621 harvest celebration Thanksgiving. Nobody claimed it was about the Indians teaching the white man how to share. They would have thought that was actually like the funniest thing they've ever heard in their lives. And Plymouth held occasional days of Thanksgiving, all of which, of course, were religious in character. But that story pretty much stayed buried in William Bradford's journal, which itself was lost during the American Revolution, actually wasn't discovered and reprinted until 1856. But the modern fairy tale of Thanksgiving, that was invented in the 1800s by Sarah Josepha Hale as part of her decades-long campaign for a national Thanksgiving holiday. She was the editor of Godey's Lady Book, which was the most popular magazine in the U.S. prior to the Civil War. And she promoted this family-centric, sanitized version of the Thanksgiving story. She would write these Thanksgiving columns every November. And those are the origin of our stereotypical image of what a Thanksgiving dinner looks like. The roasted turkey, the cranberry sauce, neither of which appears in the 1621 accounts. Yeah, me ruining Thanksgiving dinner for not being lore accurate. Me producing a loaded firearm at the Thanksgiving dinner table to be lore accurate. So because of these columns, Abraham Lincoln began a tradition of annual Thanksgiving proclamations in 1863. Grant made it a holiday in 1870. And then finally FDR in 1941 moved Thanksgiving to the fourth Thursday every November, where of course it remains today. Now, the freaking multicultural element, that was added later. In the 20th century, of course, libtards basically sought a creation myth that depicted European colonists as the original sinners against these innocent Indians, right? And so beginning in the 1960s, textbooks were quietly replacing the truth of the Puritans' holy day with a story of a friendship betrayed, right? For no reason except evil, right? And so the 1621 feast became this moment where, Pilgrims and Indians sat down in brotherhood, followed by white treachery. And then by the 1990s, most American school children are just being taught that. They're being taught that Thanksgiving is really about mourning a freaking genocide. And the primary sources never changed. There was no new information discovered, just shit they made up in their heads. You can still see what Bradford and Winslow wrote about Like the whole 1621 feast, you could still see that yourself, how they described it. What changed was the agenda and the new narrative. And of course, it had two purposes. One, it had to strip Thanksgiving of its explicitly Christian nature. And it also had to weaponize guilt to undermine America at the exact time the left was moving so aggressively to tear everything else in the country down. And now today, this lie has become so big that politicians will literally give land acknowledgments on Thanksgiving. Universities will host decolonize your feast events. All of that rests on a story that did not exist as recently as 70 years ago. Has no support in eyewitness accounts of what actually happened. So yeah, we're celebrating Thanksgiving. We're doing it correctly. We're doing it loudly, and we're doing it proudly. Thanksgiving is the only major American holiday that began as an open act of worship to the God who delivered his people to a new land which he prepared for them. It was the first American holiday. It was giving thanks to God, the same God who parted the Red Sea, cleared the land of Plymouth with plague, and opened it to his chosen, his faithful, who crossed an ocean to plant a new church in the wilderness, to cleanse the land of pagan sacrifice and cannibalism and all the sort. And whether you regard it as, marvelous providence, as William Bradford put it, arch patriot, or you want to cite scientific research, on the reality of pre-contact North America, the result is the same. A small band of believers inherited a nearly empty coast and turned it into the America that we know and that we love today. They built the greatest civilization in the world. Everything that we love about America, the Constitution, the moon landing, air conditioning, internet, whatever. The fact that, at least for the time being, you can speak your mind without being put in prison, all of that stems from the foundation that those Bible thumpers laid in the sands of Plymouth. They didn't ask for permission. They didn't pay rent to skeletons. They thanked God, and they worked to create a civilization that towers above everything else. We owe the people we replaced absolutely nothing. They lost North America the way so many losers throughout history have lost their land. Their societies collapsed. There was disease, there was warfare, environmental disaster, long before a single English boot, buckle or otherwise, touched the ground. The survivors sold land to the colonists, maybe they allied with them, and sometimes they fought them, and quite often they lost. Sometimes it got ugly. People died. Promises were broken. That's how the world works. The only difference is that our ancestors won so completely that now we can indulge in the luxury of pretending that history could have actually just been like an episode of Barney the Dinosaur, because they did all the heavy lifting. You have no idea what that stock was like, that stock of man. You could not hang. I should have mentioned this earlier. One day, they were coming back from one of these initial expeditions that they would go on. William Bradford, he's on the expedition. He comes back and they tell him, hey, yeah, by the way, your wife Dorothy, yeah, kind of funny. So she drowned in the harbor. May have been an accident. We don't know, but she's dead. Okay. So they leave their children back in Europe. She's depressed. Now she's dead. And Bradford doesn't really discuss this directly in his writing, but this is the kind of life they're facing, where death became extremely visible and extremely intertwined in their daily living. They're in this new world. They have nothing. They have no idea how they're going to survive. They have very few people. I mean, we're talking just several dozens of people left at this point, at most. Your own children are dying. Your wife or your husband, they're dying. So you're in these circumstances. You're losing the people that are the psychological anchor that is allowing you to endure the hardships of life in the first place. These hardships that you're enduring, all these new things, these things that are robbing you of your will to live at a time when your will to live is the most important thing in the world. All these people are dying. Their will to live, their will to keep going and endure, that is the most important thing that they have. It's the only thing that's going to allow them to survive. Imagine having to keep a will to live, a will to build something, to be future-oriented, to care, while at the same time watching your own children die, watching your own wife die, coming back and finding out that she drowned. Can you even conceive of that? We know in normal circumstances, people will completely lose the will to live when things like that happen. In normal, first world, luxury, convenience, things go wrong, people will completely lose the will to keep going. You lose a spouse, you lose a child, that's totally understandable. I get that. Okay, so now imagine people already in conditions that are so brutal, and they're alone, and they're having to endure all of this, and now they're dealing with that on top of that. So that should really just drive home what it means to say that Christianity, their faith in God, his providence, that drives up how real that was for them. Again, you could not hang. You're talking about trials that most people will never have to go through in their entire lives, let alone pretty much one after another. So you can just imagine how deeply they were driven by this like zealous devotion to their religion, to Christianity, and the way that they interpreted it. It wasn't just faith. It wasn't just faith. It was will. It was a will to continue and to persevere because of that faith. And a lot of people will get discouraged, but then they have faith. Well, I'm going to give up, but I have faith that at some point things will just sort of work themselves out, right? Something will just happen. And it's like, no, dude, actually, it's just us. Nobody's coming to save us. You can black pill, you can disengage, you can do all of that when you're dead. You can rest when you're dead. And for the Pilgrims, of course, this was just all a sign of their survival and their profound spiritual endurance. It was all vindication. It wasn't the end of their troubles. Not with the Indians. It wasn't even the end of their troubles with like other English settlers, but they endured because of their belief that they were accomplishing something for God. And so it didn't matter that they crossed an ocean during the wrong season. It didn't matter that basically both of the ships were compromised in some way. And it didn't matter that they were inadequately supplied. They arrived in winter in a completely desolate place. Half of them died within months, and yet they endured. And now here we are today because of that. So black pillars literally just shut up forever. We have never had more opportunity than we do right now. It could be so much worse. It was so much worse, and they endured. Remember, hope is a virtue. Fortitude is a virtue. Black pilling is a vice. Despair is a vice. You could be dead right now. Your family could be dead. It could have happened in front of you. You could have nothing. Look at their situation and look at what they built. There's nothing to black pill about. The story of our civilization, whether you want to start there or go back further, it is a story of being outnumbered. A story of going up against world historic leviathans and persevering because we have an irrational self-belief guided by our faith in God. We believe and we have this faith that this is our birthright. We are the architects of our future. Providence has been bestowed upon us. These gifts have been bestowed upon us by God. They are our birthright to defend and to bequeath to our descendants, to our posterity. Our way of life is superior. Our civilization is superior. And it is not only good, but it is necessary that it reigns supreme. There's nothing American about weepiness. People are just embarrassing themselves when they do this. On Thanksgiving, you're going to black pill on Thanksgiving. This does not resonate with me. I look at our situation. I look at what we're up against. Demographic change, cultural degeneration, evil, etc. It's like, damn, we got off cheap. Glad to be alive now. Correcting the course is not nearly as bad as having to chart it blindly, don't you think? So, yeah, when you sit down this Thanksgiving, do not bow your head in guilt. Do not bow your head, but to pray and thank God, just as your ancestors did. Thank the same God the Pilgrims thanked for the same reason that they did, because he gave this land to his people and to their children to make the greatest civilization in recorded history. Apologize for nothing. Apologize for nothing your forefathers did to build America, and apologize for nothing that you will do to restore it. That's the message. Now, speaking of colonial America, speaking of the British, the Americans, I understand, we're talking about a message of radical separatism. Remember the tea story? Okay, well, if you like tea, I have something for you. Believe it or not, a product. You need to know what's in your products. Chinese tea, because the Chinese are actually evil, they are like flooding American products with contaminants, microplastics, heavy metals. They don't care about your health. They actually just want to kill you. And also, if they can make some money in the meantime, they'll take it, right? Kindred Harvest is the American answer. Third-party lab tested, 0 microplastics, 0 heavy metals, blended and packed right here in America with 100% biodegradable, heat-sealed containers. No glue, no ink, no compromises. Morning energy, evening herbal relaxation. It's clean tea for your entire family. You need tea. It's good for you. Stop trusting China with your family's health. Choose American quality. Break out of the longhouse and choose Kindred Harvest. Cultivating goodness daily, so important. Go to kindredharvest.com. Use code Doyle for 20% off. That is kindredharvest.com. Use code Doyle for 20% off. We are going to come back with our very cool friend, Mr. Auron MacIntyre. Do stay tuned. All right, ladies and gentlemen, now joining the program for our second cool friend of the week ever, we have our very cool friend, you know him, you love him, Mr. Auron MacIntyre joining the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So we're talking about Thanksgiving. We're talking about the authentic history of Thanksgiving. I wanted to just kind of get your perspective, not only of the history, but your lived experience, if you will, from actually teaching about this holiday to kids in public school. Because if I recall correctly from your timeline, one of your jobs before you became a face lord was actually teaching history in American public schools. And so I'm curious, is the subversion actually that bad? Were kids receptive to hearing maybe your take on it? What was that like?
Yeah, I taught civics and history in public school down in Florida. And while Florida is better than most, the curriculum there is an improvement over something you're going to get in New York or something like that.
Sure.
It's still really bad. The kids really know two things about the United States. We killed the Indians and we enslaved black people. That's literally all the history that they know. And that's
Yeah.
what gets reinforced over and over again. And it's so funny because if you look, just look on YouTube and you'll see the real history of American Thanksgiving. And every single one of these videos that is uncovering the real history is just parroting exactly the line that's being taught in public schools. So that the perception that students have of Thanksgiving is very much, well, it was very kind for the Native Americans to rescue the poor European people from their fate. And, the Europeans eventually just repaid them by wiping them all out. And that really shows the evil nature of America and how it's all just founded on this blood ritual of destroying the American Indians after they helped out the English people.
Yeah, I always thought that was funny because obviously I learned that. And I learned that every time we did American history, whether it was in 8th grade or 2nd grade or, in high school. And it was funny because I swear every time I was taught this, my teachers would literally say the words, and we don't like to talk about this in America. Quite often, we erase this, we ignore this, but the real history, and I'm like, every iteration of this history I've ever gotten, whether it's from like the History Channel I stumble across or from my teachers in public schools who are receiving a taxpayer salary, they are the ones like delivering this information to me that they simultaneously are saying cannot and is not ever delivered to us. And so it's this like perpetual like libtard impulse to be convinced that no matter how syndicated their beliefs are and how intolerant of dissent they are, they're still somehow these like indefinite eternal revolutionaries, and they're accessing something naughty. And of course their barometer for that would just be like whether their uncle or their Christian dad like is upset at their version of the telling.
Yeah, it's one of these scenarios where the left only really exists to deconstruct things, right? That's the entire purpose of it. And even when they enter into the halls of power, even when they are entirely in control of the institutions and the narrative, it still has to be subversive in some way. Oh, don't worry, I'm still breaking out the real truth. That's why it's always an attack on Christianity. No matter how much power Christians lose, how little influence they have in any specific political movement, it doesn't matter. They are the enemy. They're the ones in charge. The subversive leftists are always the scrappy underdogs that are trying to bring you the truth. You poor, indoctrinated idiot, you chud in the middle of the country, believing that your people aren't evil, that it might be okay to celebrate the fact that your people are actually brave pioneers who carved out a new land and conquered an incredible empire across North America. None of these things are things that we can celebrate. And to be fair, I think that is part of the problem. We in America have been very cautious about celebrating our victories. We see every one of these as some kind of self-flagellation. Well, we didn't win World War II because we're awesome and we're powerful and we deserve to, have this influence. We did it because we're trying to help the scrappy underdog. We didn't fight any of these, these wars to expand and become this great nation because we are conquerors. We are people who do great things. It's because, well, actually, we're kind of embarrassed for having kind of stumbled over these people and taken their land, and we shystered them out of all of it. And so these are all things we need to feel very, very bad about. And so that's just the perpetual message underlying everything, and Thanksgiving is no different.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And, we discussed that just a minute ago, how the Pilgrims, before they were even on the Mayflower, before they were even enduring those hardships, these were people who were facing hardships, obviously, in Europe. They spent time in the Netherlands. And these were people who then, once they were over in America, believed that everything that they were doing was like essentially divine mandate. They had God's providence in accomplishing everything that they did, whether it's, civilizing the land, building the land, conquering the land, to expand, Christian empire, Christendom to the next ocean they encountered. And they had this like irrational self-belief driven by their faith in God that all of this was a sign and that they were to spread Christianity to the new world. And that, you know, whether the Indians wanted to go along with that or not, we'll say, was ultimately like, you know, of no issue or no concern to them. And they had this belief not only in themselves and in their faith in God, but just as a civilization, that their way of life was superior and that it was not only good, but necessary that it be imposed on the rest of the world. You know, not because of this sense of like guilt, like, oops, sorry, we killed you or whatever, but truly because everybody is better off for it, which, I mean, the historical record would tend to corroborate. It's like the meme of, yeah, sorry, the cannibalism will stop, actually. Sorry, the human sacrifice will stop, and we're all better off for it.
Yeah, it really is amazing the level of punishment the dissenters went through. First, of course, fleeing England. And then even when in the Netherlands, as you pointed out, they recognized that their own identity might end up being subsumed. They needed to go carve something out. Their identity was worthy of being preserved, and they were willing to go to a completely inhospitable land and build something new in order to do so. The fact that they felt that level of confidence, that level of divine mission, that providence was going to drive them forward into this new land was incredible, especially when you look at the casualty rates early on. Like, these are not immigrants coming over to an established land to get welfare and healthcare and all of these things. These are people who are going in, losing half their family, oftentimes through disease and through attacks by Native Americans and all of these other harsh things that existed in the United States at the time. And they are cutting a swath out of this to become one of the greatest countries in the history of the world. And rather than celebrate that, the emphasis, well, you know, really, you know, these people were friends, and then it degenerated even more into, actually, turns out your ancestors were evil, and they were the ones that were pulling the rug out from under the peaceful Indians who ultimately just wanted to help them out. And this is the story you heard over and over again. Of course, it's far more nuanced. There are, of course, Indians that helped. There were peace treaties involved. You know, there were positive things that come out of this. The relationship between the Anglo-Americans and the indigenous Americans at that time is not one of just hostility. There are also moments of brotherhood, of peace, of working together. But the fact that the entire holiday has just been turned into kind of this land acknowledgement, this need to apologize for your existence and for the fact that your ancestors did something that is worthy of being celebrated. That's the real travesty. And of course, you know, this wasn't even an official American holiday until Abraham Lincoln started doing the proclamations again on a regular basis, and then Grant signs into law that there's a set number of these holidays, including Thanksgiving. And this becomes really one of the most central holidays to the American experience, which is why I kind of hate the fact that the commercialization has jumped over from Halloween to Christmas, and we just have this moment where there is no Thanksgiving. It's been eaten up in the zeitgeist by kind of the fact that these other two holidays are easier to commercialize. And so I'm glad that we can take the time to carve this out, because I do think this is probably one of the most important, uniquely American holidays available to us.
Absolutely. The first holiday, the first American holiday, literally giving thanks to God for survival, for these blessings, for this new land. And then, yeah, I mean, you alluded to this, you know, it wasn't even celebrated. I think it was actually sort of lost to history for a while until Bradford's journal was discovered sometime in the 19th century. And then, like you said, with Lincoln, we had these proclamations of Thanksgiving, and then that continued. But it wasn't until the 1960s where this like narrative or this like creation myth of Thanksgiving became, you know, more common. And then by the 1990s, everybody was learning this, like, yeah, you know, the story of Thanksgiving is not as we're describing. The story of Thanksgiving is basically that these like, you know, enlightened noble savages saved these stupid Anglos from themselves. And then the Anglos, because they're evil, just like betrayed them. That's sort of like the asterisk of the discussion. It's like, you know, you're 5 years old and what happened after the feast? And then your teacher's like, they killed them all, you know, with smallpox blankets, which likewise is not even true. But yeah, the actual like impetus behind the celebration and the reason for the feast was exactly that. It was a fundamentally Christian holiday. There's a Christian nature of it that was, of course, erased, subverted. There was also, you know, the sort of like mandate and confidence in the future of the civilization. Both of those had to be stripped from the holiday. And insofar as it exists in the mind of the young American or the American in general, it's just a reminder that like, hey, you know how those other things you did were evil? Well, guess what? When you're eating today, it's also evil in itself. And so it's just a way of, yeah, like everything else, stripping the fundamental confidence in Christianity from it. I mean, that was sort of like what we were thinking about today and putting together the episode. Like Thanksgiving as a holiday for Christ and to conquer, both in the name of the American civilization, something that was born of that project, born of something where people believed that they were spreading this faith to the New World and that they were doing the right thing, and that we shouldn't apologize for anything that they did to bring that about, and that we won't likewise apologize for anything that we do to restore it.
Yeah, and I think this is really the attitude that conservatives, the right, needs to take. One of the reasons that this narrative is allowed to persist in public education is, let's be frank, a lot of conservatives believe a part of this, right? Like, this is the Yellowstone meme, right? That ultimately, well, we do owe something and we have done this terrible thing and we are at some level these people. Maybe it's not as bad as the left says, but the kernel of truth is there, and so it's allowed to persist. And the mentality shift has to be that ultimately, no, our ancestors did great things. No one is perfect. Everyone is flawed. Yes, at some level, all great men are flawed, but that's not what makes them interesting. Their greatness makes them interesting. And so, yeah, you could drill down and find terrible things that people have done. But at the end of the day, what we think about throughout history is the greatness that people have achieved. And that is most certainly true of early Americans, their ability to persevere, their absolute determination to move through all these incredible difficulties and overcome, their faith, their incredible faith in God, one that we could not even fathom having at this level. And most people would fold like a card table if they had to endure 1/10 of what the Pilgrims, the dissenters, ultimately felt when they came to the United States. And that is something that we need to be proud of, and we need to see as a positive aspect of American character. It's not something to apologize for. It's not something to run away from. You can acknowledge the real history. It's even okay. You can really talk about ways in which maybe a Native American tribe ended up getting betrayed at some time, but understanding that ultimately, I mean, do we go back and think about Julius Caesar and how he played the Gauls off against each other? And how could you see, ultimately that means Rome was founded in evil. Like, no, we don't have that mentality with any other historical country, nation, and it shouldn't be one with ours.
That's absolutely right. And even too, like, if you want to take it there, if you want to keep score, I am perfectly willing to keep score of all the bad things we did, if on the other side of that, we get to keep and compare scores for all the good stuff we did. But, they would not want to have that conversation. They want to just uniquely indict us for the bad, pretend that the good doesn't exist. And we just simply cannot allow it to happen. We cannot apologize for it. And I was trying to bring this up too, just sort of in like the wake of a lot of blackpilling you see, maybe by nature of the internet making everybody insane. But I tried to communicate to people exactly like you said. You could not hang with this stock of person. I mean, you're talking about all of your wife dying, your children dying, everything's left behind. You have nothing. All of these things that would like psychologically anchor you to hope and to sanity are being stripped from you. And this idea that these people just continued to persevere and build what we now enjoy and love, it is just an inconceivable like stock of person who was able to do that simply because their determination and their fortitude was so strong. And nowadays, we know that in convenience and luxury, the slightest thing could happen, or even significant things can happen, and people just want to like melt down, throw it all away, lose their will to live. And you can just imagine what these people would be like if they were actually on the Mayflower, if they were actually, in Plymouth dealing with this, having to bury their dead in secret because they don't want to telegraph to nearby Indian tribes that they're, weak, just things of that nature. I mean, these people would have just folded in a second. And so it is quite convenient to be here in 2025 America and to declare, it's over now, whereas our history is one of fighting off, depopulation, fighting off world historic leviathans, and these people somehow made it. And so I'm quite confident that we won't have a problem either. It'll certainly be difficult and require us meeting that expectation, but the idea that it's impossible or that we should give into some kind of despair is not only un-American, it's just completely stupid.
Well, and this is why recovering American identity is so important, right? We've been told that America is just an idea. It's just some random, set of beliefs that floats out in the air and nothing. It's an economic zone, these kind of things. But no, we are a people with a history. We are a people with a heritage. We are a people who have a long line of overcoming and being impressive and conquering and overcoming challenges and enduring incredible difficulty and having a deep faith in a providential God that will guide us towards these ends. And there's zero reason for us to abandon this, to somehow embrace this weak idea that we have, and instead we are some other, disembodied idea. No, we have these roots. This is who we are. This is our history, and this is how we should attach ourselves to it. The goal is not to lament that people have fallen away from these ideas or that the economic zone is doomed. The goal is to recapture that identity, that belief, those roots in who we are. We need to become worthy of the men who founded this country. We need to recognize the impeccable nature of the founding stock of this country, and we need to look to them and their guidance and their example in how we should be looking at our current situation. You're absolutely right. There's just no comparison to the dire things that they had to go through to overcome and become who they were and to make this country what it is. And who are we sitting around with Netflix accounts and Uber Eats to complain and talk about ridiculous? Now, this is not to say we don't have real problems. This is not a pick yourself up by the bootstraps, you ate too many avocado toast to buy a house speeches. Right. But the point is that though all your problems are real, but you are no more worthy of despair than the Pilgrims were. They were able to face those things and overcome, and you should be able to too.
That's right. They became who they were, as you said. It's absolutely true. Mr. MacIntyre, thank you for joining the program. I do have to ask before you depart, what are you thankful for, and what is your favorite Thanksgiving food?
I am always a fan of the stuffing or the pecan pie. Those are my two favorite parts of Thanksgiving. And I am just incredibly blessed with a family and extended family of God-fearing people who love this country. I'm one of those rare people who gets to go to Thanksgiving dinner and never have an argument over politics because I just have a family chock full of patriots. So incredibly thankful for that.
And you are of the cloth. You are of the cloth yourself. Well, thank you for joining us. We'll have you back on sometime soon. Have a great Thanksgiving. And yeah, everybody go check them out. Well, actually, tell people where they can find you, assuming they're not yet illuminated.
Oh, of course. Well, I am lucky enough to share a platform with John here. So we are both on the Blaze. And of course, you can catch my stuff on BlazeTV, also on all your favorite podcast networks, YouTube, Rumble. And of course, I'm posting on places like Gab and Twitter under Auron MacIntyre.
Yes, a poster you are indeed. All right. Happy Thanksgiving. I want to take a moment and speak directly to the people, because the truth is, as our friend mentioned, Blaze TV does not exist without people like you, people who genuinely care about preserving honest conversation in this country. I mean, you see what's happening on the right. You've got the gatekeeping, you've got the approved narratives, pressure for people to fall in line. Turns out you can actually just say whatever you want. You know, people were like, you can't say whatever you want. Well, it turns out you actually can. No one's bound to talking points. No one's beholden to anyone's agenda. We don't have to check our convictions with our sponsors before we speak. You can literally just say whatever you want. And yeah, that's how we believe it. We believe in telling the truth about America to Americans, and that only exists because of our wonderful Blaze TV subscribers. So once a year, we lower the barrier for people who want to be a part of this, people who refuse to just sit on the sidelines. And so right now, Black Friday, you know, he's talking about the consumerism. Sorry, you got to play ball. We'll fix the problem later. You can get $40 off a Blaze TV annual subscription if you've been on the fence, which I'm sure you all have been. Now is the moment. Not because of a discount, but because your subscription actually keep independent voices alive, voices that aren't controlled by the usual suspects, gatekeepers, XYZ. You make it all possible for us to keep fighting this fight, creating this content, talking about politics on the internet. So if you still believe that this is a fight worth fighting, you're already a subscriber. Well, thank you. You make all this possible. And, you know, you make it possible for people to exist in spaces that aren't, you know, focused on these kinds of, we'll say, typical cycles, right? So all of this to say, go to blazetv.com/Doyle, use code BlackFriday40 to grab our Black Friday savings. While it's still here, we're going to have some pretty good content there for you. Not trying to spoil anything, but go to blazetv.com/Doyle, code BlackFriday40. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll get you out of here. I hope you have a fantastic Thanksgiving. I hope you eat a lot of food, and I hope you have a great time with your family and with your friends if you're doing, you know, those Friendsgiving thing or whatever. And just remember what the holiday's about. Remember that we are giving thanks to God for our blessings. We are not apologizing for anything that happened to get us up to this point, and we will not apologize for a thing that it takes to restore our civilization to something that our ancestors could be proud of and that they would recognize. That is what this holiday is about. So be sure, if you liked our wonderful holiday discussion, to go to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. Be nice to us on the internet. Very important. Leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe, share it with a friend. Share it with your libtard relative who does not understand, who is not yet illuminated as to the true meaning of Thanksgiving, which we have restored. On to the next holiday. on to the next one. So thank you so much for watching. May God bless you, your family, America, and we'll see you next time.